All right, next, when we're talking about the language of anatomy, is to look at directional terms. Now, these are similar to regional terms, but you can only use them when you're comparing two structures because they're terms of relative position. They're used to explain where one body structure is in relation to another. So that allows us to locate body parts precisely. So here we see a really quick list of all the directional terms. Now, what I want you to note before we go on to the next couple of slides is that these are paired up. They mean the opposite of each other, the ones that are in pairs. So superior is paired with inferior. Anterior is paired with posterior. Medial and lateral are paired. Proximal and distal are paired. And superficial and deep are paired. So let's talk about what each one means. So superior means towards the head or the cranial region of the body. When you're using it to compare two structures, it usually means one structure is above the other structure. Like, for example, the head being above the chest. I could say that as the head is superior to the chest. Inferior means the opposite of superior. Inferior, also known as caudal, means away from the head or towards the feet, towards the lower part of the body. So it generally means below. So the chest is below the head. Or I could say the chest is inferior to the head. Moving on to the next pair, we have ventral and dorsal. Now, for a bipedal organism like a human that walks on two legs, ventral and anterior, same thing. Dorsal and posterior, same thing. But that would not be the case for a four-legged organism, because ventral means towards the belly and anterior means towards the front. For humans, that's the same thing, but not for a dog. Dorsal means towards the spine, and posterior means towards the back. Now, for humans, same thing, but not for another animal like a cat. So we're going to use them as the same thing because we're talking about humans, but just keep that in mind. So ventral means towards the front or the belly. Something that is in front of something else would be ventral. Dorsal means towards the back or the spine. Something that is dorsal compared to something else would be in the back or behind. We can also look at medial and lateral. So medial is towards the midline. Lateral is away from the midline. So they're another pair and they're opposites of each other. So for example, the nose is medial to the cheek, but the cheeks are lateral to the nose. And we don't really use intermediate too much, but that's between a more medial and a more lateral structure. Now, probably the ones that are the most difficult, just because they have caveats, are proximal and distal. Now, you only use proximal and distal if both the structures you're looking at are on a limb. And not just on any limb, on the same limb. So I could use proximal and distal to compare my wrist and my elbow, but not my wrist and my ankle. I could use proximal and distal to compare my knee and my ankle, but not my knee and my belly button. So to use proximal and distal, you have to be comparing two structures that are on the same limb. So like my elbow is proximal to the wrist, or my knee is distal to the thigh. So let's talk about what they mean. When we talk about proximal, we're talking about a structure being in closer proximity to the point of attachment for that limb compared to the other. For example, my elbow is closer to my shoulder than my wrist is to my shoulder. Since my shoulder is approximately where my upper limb attaches to the trunk, that's my point of attachment. So the elbow is always going to be proximal to the wrist because it's always going to be closer to that point of attachment than the wrist. Distal means the opposite. It means that structure is further from the point of attachment than the other structure. So let's just reverse the one we were looking at. My wrist is distal to my elbow because my wrist is a further distance away from the point of attachment for the upper limb than my elbow. We could also say the knee is distal to the thigh because the knee is further away from the hip, which is the point of attachment for the lower limb, than the thigh region is. But again, if I was comparing hip to belly button, wrist to ankle, anything other than two structures on the same limb, I wouldn't even use proximal and distal. I wouldn't even consider them possible answers. All right, let's go on and move away from proximal and distal and look at superficial and deep, two other pairs. Superficial means external, so closer to the body surface, and deep means away from the body surface. So muscle is deep to the skin, and the skin is superficial to the muscle. Something that's internal to the body is deep to the skin. The skin for our body is one of the most superficial structures. Now, if you're a little confused, let's do some practice. All right, so first let's do some practice on the regional terms that you learned in another video. What are the proper regional terms for the nose? If you said nasal, you got it. Lips? Did you say oral? You got that too. All right, let's go back up to our directional term practice question. The nose is blank to the lips. So the nose is above the lips. So I want to look for which term means above. If you go back and review your directional terms, the term that means above is superior. So superior is the correct answer. But you can also do a trick, basically kind of read the question backwards to just double check yourself. Now, while I explain this, please follow along in person. So touch your lips, touch the second structure. Now move your hand from your lips to your nose, the first structure. So we're starting with the second structure, and either touch it or imagine touching it, and then touch your nose or imagine touching it. Which direction did you move? Up, down, left, right, up, above, towards the head? So all of those directions that you moved, up, above, towards the head, whichever one that you want to label it as, mean superior. That's what superior means. So that's a trick just to double check these types of directional term practice problems. All right, let's try another one. First, let's review some regional terms. What is the name for the knee? You said patella. You got it. The ankle? Did you say tarsal? If you did, you're correct. All right, let's go up to our other practice problem for directional terms. The knee is blank to the ankle. So I have all of these answer choices, but I'm comparing two structures that are on the same limb. So that immediately gets rid of most of my answer choices. Can't be posterior, can't be lateral, can't be medial, can't be superior. Why? Because I'm comparing two structures on the same limb. Two structures on the lower limb. The only terms I'm going to use to describe them is either proximal or distal. And I don't have distal as an answer choice. So my answer is proximal. That would be one way to do this question. But I could also say my knee is closer, proximal, than my ankle to the point of attachment, which is the hip. Probably these are the ones that I would say use the trick. They help the most to figure out if proximal or distal is the option you want to go with, especially if both are in your multiple choice answers. So touch your ankle or imagine touching your ankle, then move towards your knee or imagine moving towards your knee. Did you get closer to the hip, the point of attachment, or further away from the hip, the point of attachment? Closer? Well, in closer proximity is proximal. So that's why it's your answer. So again, to double check these questions, start with the second structure and move either literally or figuratively towards the first structure and see if the direction you moved matches the definition for your answer. All right, one of our final topics is going to be body cavities and membranes. So body cavities line internal spaces that are closed to the environment. These are closed body cavities. They provide a little bit differing degrees of protection depending on what's inside. There's two main sets, or I should say general sets of cavities, the dorsal body cavity and the ventral body cavity. The dorsal body cavity is in the back of the body and contains the cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity, sometimes called the spinal cavity. In the cranial cavity, you find the brain. In the vertebral cavity, you find the spinal cord. The front or ventral body cavity is towards the belly, and it contains many subdivisions, including the thoracic and abdominopelvic cavity. In the thoracic cavity, which is above your diaphragm, it's generally your chest region. You'll find the 2 pleural cavities that contain your lungs, and 1 pericardial cavity that contains your heart. Your abdominopelvic cavity is made up of the abdominal and pelvic cavity separately, so the term abdominopelvic combines those 2 cavity names. Now, the dorsal body cavity is not as broad, doesn't have as much in it as the ventral body cavity, but it's still very important because it protects the fragile nervous system. The cranial and spinal cavity or vertebral cavity make up this dorsal body cavity. The ventral body cavity houses many of the other internal organs, those of your heart, your lungs, your digestive organs, urinary, reproductive organs. Those are all in the ventral or front body cavity. Thoracic is above your diaphragm, abdominopelvic is below your diaphragm, and we're going to look at thoracic first, with its 2 pleural cavities protecting the lungs, its pericardial cavity in the middle mediastinal region, and the superior mediastinum that's above it. And then we'll move on to your abdominopelvic cavity, where we have digestive, urinary, and reproductive organs. All right, here are the body cavities. Let's look at the dorsal body cavity in the image on the left in yellow. We have the cranial cavity up top, and then the vertebral cavity down below. So what's in the cranial cavity? The brain. What's in the vertebral cavity? The spinal cord. All right, now let's look at the thoracic cavity. It's above this membrane called the diaphragm. And then below these 2 spaces together, they're the abdominopelvic cavity. But we can see in this image on the left that they're separated. Abdominal is above pelvic. All right, let's look at the image on the right. We're going to be focusing now on that red cavity, which is towards the front of the body. So we're looking at the ventral body cavity. Above the diaphragm, you have the pericardial cavity that contains the heart. The heart sits in this middle region between the lungs. This whole middle region is called the mediastinum. This little kind of almost upside down triangle is called the superior mediastinum. It doesn't include the heart, but it does contain bronchial tubes going to your lungs, major arteries, and other blood vessels. And it contains parts of your esophagus and your trachea. But it's not your lungs or your heart, but it is associated structures. We also have these 2 pleural cavities. You have 2 lungs, you have 2 pleural cavities protecting both lungs, and those lungs are lateral to the mediastinum or lateral to the heart. So that's a quick view of our body cavities. Make sure you go back and review them. Thoracic cavity probably will take a little bit longer. Some of these terms are probably brand new to you, especially mediastinum, pericardial, pleural, and depending on a question you're given, you could be either more or less specific. For example, if I wanted to know 3 cavities where I could find the heart, well, I could find the heart in the pericardial cavity. I could also find the heart in the thoracic cavity. And I could find the heart in the ventral body cavity. All of those answers are correct. Ventral body cavity doesn't help me out a lot. I just have to look at the whole front cavity. What if I have no idea where the heart is? Thoracic cavity is a little more specific. I know I want to look above the diaphragm in the front cavity, but pericardial cavity, that is the most specific. I want to look in the front cavity, between the lungs, where the heart is located, within a protective membrane. Abdominal pelvic cavity may be a little bit easier for you, because abdominal, pelvic, those are terms most people know, even if they've never taken an anatomy and physiology course. These contain most of the body viscera, the stomach, the intestines, the liver. In the pelvic cavity, we have things like the urinary bladder, many reproductive organs, and the rectum. So as you get used to different body organs and tissues and things like that, you'll start to be able to place them in an organized manner within these paradigms. So again, let's take a quick look at the dorsal body cavity. Locate the cavity that contains the brain. Are you looking at the cranial cavity? If so, you're correct. All right, locate the cavity that contains just the heart. Did you say pericardial cavity? If so, you're correct. All right, name a cavity where I could find a lung. Did you say pleural cavity? No? Ventral cavity. How about thoracic cavity? Any of those answers are correct. But if I said, hey, can you give me a cavity that just contains the lungs? You'd want to say pleural cavity. So again, another slide that's great to come back and review. All right, now let's finish up with talking about membranes. So in these cavities, you have serosa or serous membranes. These are thin double-layered membranes. The two layers are called the parietal and the visceral serosa. The space between them contains a fluid called a serous fluid. The parietal serosa is closer to the cavity walls, and the visceral serosa is closer to the organs. Body viscera means body organs, so it makes sense that the visceral serosa is closer to the organs. Now, these are very thin layers. They have that lubricating fluid between them, and they're protective. And they definitely fill the space between these body cavities and are going to help support the structures within. Here's kind of what it looks like. So picture a balloon. You're going to punch the balloon. Now imagine your fist is an organ, like the heart. Now, if your balloon doesn't pop, the layer of the balloon that touches your hand is the visceral serosa. The air around your hand is the serous cavity that contains the serous fluid. And the part of the balloon that doesn't touch your hand, that's going to be the parietal serosa. Notice that even though there's two membranes, they're connected. They're connected near your wrist, where the inner membrane folds inward. So a serosa is a double-layered membrane with fluid in between the membranes. And what is the role? What's the purpose of these structures? Besides just kind of holding stuff in place. Well, that lubricating fluid allows structures like the heart to expand and contract and move, but to do so without rubbing against other structures, to do so without producing heat, which can lead to inflammation. So these are going to be friction-reducing structures. Now, depending on which serous membrane you're talking about, we have terms for them. We can be pretty specific when we talk about serous membranes. So if you want to talk about the serous membrane that covers the heart, you can say you're talking about the pericardium. If you want to talk about the serous membrane covering the lungs, you're talking about the pleurae, or pleura for singular. If you want to talk about the serous membrane that is very extensive and sometimes doubles back on itself in the abdominal pelvic cavity, you're talking about the peritoneum. And not all organs in the abdominal pelvic cavity are surrounded by this peritoneum. Some sit behind this peritoneum and are considered retroperitoneal, like the kidneys. And when you talk about these membranes, you can say something like parietal pericardium, visceral pericardium, visceral peritoneum. You can talk about the two layers separately, but they're all serous membranes with double layers, with fluid in between the layers, and they can all become inflamed. Maybe it's infection or other causes that causes this inflammation. It can make these really smooth layers that are supposed to reduce friction become rough. They can stick together. It can be very painful. Pleurisy and peritonitis, so inflammation of the pleura and the peritoneum respectively, are some examples of serous membranes becoming inflamed. All right, and to finish up, we're going to talk about abdominal pelvic quadrants. These are divisions used primarily by medical personnel. They're very broad. We're going to lay a very basic grid that has 4 spaces over the abdominal pelvic area. And again, this is going to be looked at as if this is a patient. So the right side is going to be your left, and the left side is going to be your right. And we're going to separate the quadrants into right upper, right lower, left upper, and left lower quadrants. This allows for medical personnel and EMS personnel to very quickly, when they get on the scene, figure out where a laceration or injury is located. Whereas anatomists, they're going to be a little bit more specific. They'll use the 9 divisions called abdominopelvic regions. And these are similar left and right. You have a left hypochondriac region, right hypochondriac region, left lumbar, right lumbar region, left iliac, right iliac region. And then the middle ones are epigastric up top, umbilical in the middle, over your belly button, and hypogastric or pubic down below. You can see in the image on the right that we have a tic-tac-toe grid that overlays the abdominal pelvic region for the abdominal pelvic region study. Makes sense. So for example, the stomach is predominantly in the epigastric region. The bladder is in the hypogastric region. Most of the descending colon is going to be located in the left lumbar region, but you want to know in general where a lot of these organs are located. So make sure you come back and practice this. Let's talk about the terms so you know a little bit about why they're called what they are. Hypochondriac regions are located under the cartilage of the ribs. Hypo means under, chondro means cartilage. The lumbar region, while shown in the front, is at the lower back region, which is similarly called the lumbar region. There is a blood vessel called the iliac vessel in that general region where we see the left and right iliac. That's also at the inguinal region where we see that fold between the thigh and the trunk. Epigastric means above or upon the stomach, and it's above the umbilical region, roughly where the stomach's located. And hypogastric or pubic is below the stomach or near the pubic region. So there is some rhyme and reason to the naming. And keep in mind, there's other body cavities. There's oral and digestive cavities, nasal cavities, orbital cavities, middle ear cavities. When we get later to a chapter all about joints, we'll look at synovial cavities. So these are just a brief introduction to many of the cavities and planes and languages that we can use to make sure everything that we talk about in anatomy and physiology is specific and precise. And we want to avoid misunderstanding by utilizing this type of language. If you're confused anywhere, please feel free to contact me. And also make sure you watch all the other videos if you missed one.